Okay, we're going to start up again. David Cecchetto, one of the many brilliant thinkers it's my pleasure to know and work with and have regular conversations with. David's an assistant professor of critical digital theory in the Department of Humanities at York University. He's also the author of the recently published Humanesis, Sound and Technological Posthumanism. It's in the Posthumanities series on the University of Minnesota Press. I encourage you to get a copy of it before they have to go into second printing. Without further ado, David and his fat head. No
Isn't that your band?
No one's.
Hi, Dan. Sorry, I want to. I sincerely want to thank actually Marc and Eldritch for putting this together. I think they're both incredibly intellectually generous people, which is the highest compliment I know of. And I think that the spirit of the room, that even allows Eldritch to kind of voice his being pissed off at the last presentation, is actually a direct result of that kind of general generosity. And I think it's very difficult to map those qualities onto a room. And I think you two have done a really great job. So thanks for that. I often like to speak of myself as a practicing non-musician, but I don't actually do that much practicing anymore. So I guess I'm a quasi-practicing non-musician at this point. And this paper is a little different for me insofar as it connects as much to that part of my life as to other parts. So without further ado. One night, I dreamt my head was 1,000 feet wide. The expansion was executed between the outside edge of each of my eyes and the inside edge of each corresponding ear. The distance between my eyes remained the same, but that between my ears increased greatly. In the dream, I'm sitting dead center in the Alex Goulden Hall here in Toronto, listening to a pianist, and I can't say who it is, play Bach's Goldberg variations, and specifically the aria. The playing is beautiful, perhaps the more so because there's a half-second delay between the visible actions of the pianist and the music I'm hearing. The delay is unsettling. I feel at once as though I'm acutely present and strangely distant. Present because I'm buzzing with this new configuration of my senses, my eyes scrambling for a purchase that would let them skip the beat that insists on separating them from what I hear. And strangely present too because there are weird congruencies of timing where what I'm hearing does seem to line up, a kind of temporal coincidence that isn't really that surprising given, as Mark Hansen puts it, the world of continuous multi-scalar transition that we live in, and really specifically the performance space of the concert hall, which insofar as it acts as a space of inscription, increases the probability of capturing instances of differential repetition, and therefore also the discovery of coincidences. And yet, there's also a certain self-dissociation that comes with hearing everything in delay, or with seeing in advance, I suppose. What's experienced temporally as a deferral is also experienced spatially as a gap within myself that's widened by the heightened reflexivity of hearing myself seen. That is, to the extent that my senses can be categorically differentiated from one another, which I think is actually quite limited, but it's not altogether absent. To that extent, the temporally non-coincident experience of watching the pianist play a half second ahead of what I hear is parsed as a temporally continuous experience of bodily non-coincidence. I hear that what I'm hearing has somehow lagged behind my vision without ever ceasing to hear and see. And actually, my seeing is no less visual for having been heard. So the delay feels specifically technical, but it's a kind of autonomic techniques, as my friend Ted Hebert might say. It's a great book called Nonsense, In Praise of Nonsense. It's a kind of machinic weirdness that therefore I am. Indeed, the feeling persists even as I close my eyes and thereby disintegrate the sensory dissociation. As Marc likes to remind us, from the perspective of analog film production, synchronization is actually the most contrived sound-image relation because of the technical awkwardness of combining the two media on the film strip. And this is, of course, long since changed in the metamedial context of digital computers, but I wonder if something of the reiterative sensory difference that underwrites traditional film doesn't remain. And indeed, I think today it returns redoubled in Bluetooth technologies, which of course separate sound and vision when we stream audio whilst watching something.
That's what it
This raises the question, which admittedly distracts me from the aria. Will a perceptual adaptation akin to that demonstrated by Stratton Glasses in the 1890s take hold? Right, after wearing image-inverting glasses for 4 days, images appeared upright to Stratton until he concentrated on them, and then they became inverted again. So by having to concentrate on his vision to turn the image upside down again, especially when he knew that images were hitting his retinas in the opposite orientation as normal, by having to concentrate to flip it back to the unnatural orientation that's natural to the technical apparatus of the glasses. Specifically by having to concentrate, Stratton deduced that his brain had reprocessed his vision and adapted to the change in visual orientation. And so I'm curious, if the concert stretches on for more than 4 days, roughly 96 iterations of the complete set of variations, or I suppose roughly 1900 repetitions of the aria, if the concert stretches on for 4 days, will the audibility of the delay become collapsible subject to my concentration? And unfortunately, it's that thought that wakes me. Another night, I again dreamt my head was 1,000 feet wide. And in the dream, I'm sitting at a piano, elegantly playing my way through the aria of the Goldberg variations. I sound remarkably skilled, much more so than I'm accustomed to, but still have to track my playing visually, cocking my head left and right to look at the keys that my fingers will next to press. So as I look almost 90 degrees to the left, my right ear is practically brushing up against the piano, my left ear is nearly 1,000 feet away. So what I hear almost immediately in my right ear reaches my left ear nearly a second later. And then looking to the right, the effect is inverted, with varying delays at different points in the middle. And as I play, my eyes shift targets rapidly. There's saccadic movement flitting about the keyboard, so the effect is intermittent and I think rather noticeable. Given my physiology, my movements also produce something like a Doppler effect in my listening. And a Doppler shift, as I'm sure you know, is basically created by sound waves piling up on one another. So the classic example of a siren approaching, in that example, the emergency vehicle is emitting a frequency at a fixed rate at the source, but the waves don't arrive at a fixed frequency to the listener because the distance they have to travel decreases as the vehicle approaches. So the motion at the source redounds to increase the frequency as the vehicle approaches and results in a higher pitch at the point of reception than that which was sent. So the frequency, of course, then decreases as the vehicle recedes. Now, the width of my head, which is gigantic, really, produces this same effect when I turn it, even if it's the receiver that's moving in my case rather than the sound source. And of course, as I rotate my head, one ear approaches the piano at the same rate that the other moves further away, and I have actually a remarkably symmetrical head in that respect, therefore quite beautiful. Thus producing two Doppler shifts that are inversely directional with respect to one another. Now, as you might expect, at a certain point, the turning itself becomes more interesting than my playing, and I begin to explore this sound in itself, an exploration that's made technically possible by the magic of dreaming that allows me to, at this point, completely ignore my shortcomings as a pianist. I practice turning my head slowly, almost 180 degrees from completely left facing to the right over 15 seconds, back to the left for 30 seconds, to the center for 30 seconds, midway to the right for 5 seconds, a relatively quick turn. And when I stop moving, the Doppler effects also stop, leaving me with sounds arriving at each of my ears at slightly different times. And indeed, when I move very slowly, from just right of center to just to the left, I can hear the delays changing ever so slightly without really hearing the Doppler shifts, which is actually rather lovely. Most interesting to me, though, are the moments when the Doppling stops. As my head moves, the aria sounds unmoored from its normal pitch center. And actually, these types of transitions are typical in piano music, but they're usually executed within the rhetoric of music rather than that of frequency. So what's really beguiling to me are these moments when the aria resettles, because each time it feels to me that the pitch of the piece is moved. I've experienced it shifting after all. But when I stop moving, it doesn't so much sound like it moves back as it sounds like it settles. So this is a kind of sessile modulation, less a modulating from one key to another, as is conventional in music, than a kind of non-modulating vitality within the key itself. And then a thought hits me. In addition to the changing arrival times and the inversely complementary Doppler effects, there's a dynamic difference in volume between what I'm hearing in each ear. And this in itself makes sense, but is it really possible that a sound as quiet as a piano, played at a mezzo-piano dynamic no less, is it really possible that such a quiet sound can still be heard so clearly when my ear is, for example, 800 feet away? I think, while still playing the aria, of how the inverse square law, the law that describes the relation between distance and sound pressure intensity, I think about how that law would apply in this case, and I can't shake the feeling that what I'm hearing just doesn't sound right. Even a 15-degree turn of my head should dramatically attenuate the volume in my more distant ear, while increasing that in my more proximate ear. It should be quite dramatic. So what's comfortable when I'm facing the piano center should be intolerably loud in my right ear when I turn to the left, pretty much inaudible in my left. And while the changes in volume that I'm hearing are prominent enough to sustain the sensation of a change in distance that accompanies each turn of my head, they nonetheless seem to be happening, at least, much more moderately than they should. In short, and really put simply, I'm flummoxed as to why playing the piano with a 1,000-foot wide head isn't much quieter than it is. I look down at the piano keyboard, and it's actually been replaced by a calculator, flickering dimly. And so I listen for a few more moments, contemplating this before waking up. Another night, I dreamt my head was 100 feet wide. Still rather wide by conventional standards, but more slender by a factor of 10 than I'd become accustomed to in my dreaming life. In the dream, I'm again in the concert hall listening to a pianist, Gould I think, play the Bach aria. The music is lovely. I'm actually quite captured by it, unable to really move beyond the minute rotations of my head, keeping up with my rapidly tracking eyes, which dart swiftly and wildly insofar as eyes do, but which move actually very little in space because I'm seated some distance from the pianist, and they are, of course, triangulating. So my head hardly moves at all. And actually, the world has a coddling warmth to its soundscape when one sits still and listens with a 100-foot wide head. But other than that specific but fleeting affective memory of a slightly more lenitive world, nothing else from the dream is really remarkable. I might say that nothing takes hold, and actually, that evening I don't even really remember waking up. In The Five Senses, Michel Serres argues that, quote, listening is rooted in silence and deafness. As Steve Connor recounts in the context of tinnitus, in a really fantastic piece, Serres notes that, quote, if one understands hearing as a conversion of energy into information, of materiality into intelligibility, then hearing has to be thought of as a black box. We know what goes in, we know what comes out, but we don't know precisely what happens in the middle. Connor continues, if we ask what happens in the brain, which we are typically content to see as a simple seat of audition, then we're compelled to imagine another black box, because in the brain there's a specifiable input, namely electrochemical impulses, and output, the experience of sound. The process of transformation is never visible. So the point, I think, is that while the box receives, the reception itself is not transmitted. We must, quote, therefore be located inside this supposedly closed box, the walls of which must, as a consequence, be moved. That's Serres. So what we have from Serres is a model that treats audibility not as a threshold, but as a vanishing act of communication itself. As he outlines, quote, either there is a private dimension, in which case there are no objective messages, or the latter are in fact in circulation, in which case there is no private dimension. And indeed, in binaural listening, the intensive vanishing act performed in and as the moment and point of reception skitters over to the other ear to deafen it extensively. And it does so physically because it shadows certain frequencies, which is part of how we spatialize. But more importantly, what I would say is literally, because when the same sound is heard binaurally, such that a certain degree of difference obtains with respect to volume, the quieter channel, we'll call it, becomes inaudible. That is, it turns out that one ear's endless string of black boxes precludes, under certain conditions, the emergence of even the initial conditions for the question of communication in the other ear. So the point is, a sound's audibility isn't just relative to the sensitivity of the receiving apparatus, but also to something in that apparatus's relational framework that is constitutively obscured. As one's head widens, this obscurity becomes clear, insofar as it becomes sensible. And actually, one night I dreamt my head was 1,000 feet wide, and I'm in the Alex Goulden Hall listening to Gould again. This time I'm sure it's him. I'm listening to him play the aria from the Goldberg Variations. I'm not certain how I got here, but the aria is ending, and it seems that the performance will end with it, rather than just going ahead with the variations. The audience applauds. Gould goes through the usual machinations of post-performance bows and ovations. The lights come up, and we all mill about and chat as we exit the hall. I'm aware of, though not particularly surprised by, the dream logic that's at work in my surroundings. There's a basic Mary Poppins-style gambit that it's somehow possible for my head to be wider than the space that I'm in. But what really strikes me is the sound of the concert hall's transition from being what Eldritch, I think, rightly calls a concentration machine to something else. As the dominant soundscape expands from the single point of Gould's playing to the ambient sounds of the applause, conversation, and the various conflagrations of an exiting crowd, my own proprioceptive sensibility expands with it. When I was listening to Gould alone, I felt, in an important sense, centered and agential. I could compose the volume and delay of the aria for myself within constraints simply by turning my head. My massive cranium was something of a private Inselberg, an isolated mountain with lobed outcroppings on each side. But as this aural focal point dissipates, as Gould leaves the stage and this concentration machine becomes simply a room, it feels to me as though my mountainous head is itself returning to dust. There's no longer the sense of inversely proportional changes in volume and delay times, because what I'm hearing in one ear bears virtually no resemblance at the local level to what I'm hearing in the other. I'm tempted to say I am the din, but that might be taking it too far. In any case, I'm literally in the midst of it and outside of it, and I'm utterly addlepated by my incapability of telling the difference between a sound that's traveled across the room and one that's proximate but quiet. It's kind of the oral equivalent of holding two different spyglasses, one over each eye, pointing in disparate directions. There's no perspective, and when there's no perspective, a dachshund is just a greyhound that's a lot further away. Except my eyes remain relatively close to one another, so I still have vision as a means of verification. Unlike when I was listening to Gould, though, when my ears lagged behind my vision, this time it's my eyes that lag. And the lag doesn't happen at a rate determined by distance, as in my hearing, but instead at one determined by the speed at which I can swivel my chin atop my neck. But more than that, it's in a real sense myself that's not so much lagging as diffusing in a bureaucracy of sound, which, like every bureaucracy, impedes agential force not by attenuating the speed of one's activities, but instead by routing one's actions along circular, obscure, and repeating paths. We're all earworms in that sense when we become bureaucratic. When Gould leaves the stage, Listening with my very fat head becomes bureaucratic and tedious in direct correspondence with the increasing complexity of what I'm hearing. It's a crushing sensation. And I hope, as I become more skilled in the techniques of dreaming, I'll find a lenitive technique to live and listen in this setting in a sustained fashion, to listen with my very fat head outside the context of a concentration machine. At this time, though, I linger for a few moments, listening to my own inadequacy before simply waking up. Thanks.